Well, you remember hearing lots about the citizenship guide that was put out by the Harper government a little while ago. Created controversy because, heaven forbid, it gave more time, more ink to our military history than to, well, recycling. That brought this, a People's Citizenship Guide. It's by a bunch of left-wing academics centered out of Winnipeg. They've published it, and we wanted to bring in John Robson to talk about this. John, this is a group of people that looked at the Citizenship Guide and thought this is far too right-wing. This is not the Canada we know. Heaven forbid they've got the military involved with citizenship ceremonies. Your take on it?
Well, the first thing I want to say, surprisingly, is more power to them. They didn't like the existing one. They came up with their own. And while I consider it to contain much that is nonsensical and a good deal that's harmful, it lays out clearly and concisely a vision of Canada that's held by a lot of people. It's very significant among our elites, and it attracts a lot of voters. I mean, the NDP does elect MPs.
Yeah, no, they do.
It gives us something to look at and focus on and argue about. And everybody should have their own concise understanding of what they think Canada is. You know, get this one and figure out why you don't agree with it and teach your kids a different one.
Well, all I would add to that is I wish they'd done it without government money, because they list 4 government departments that helped fund it, including Canadian Heritage, Canadian Council for the Arts, Manitoba Council for the Arts, and the Manitoba government. So, you know.
Because Canadian politicians are so reactionary.
Yes. You know, because they... Exactly. So, your favorite, we're going to go through our favorite problems with it. Your first one.
Was on the cover, the response to Conservative Canada, quite apart from what happened to the capital letter.
This is what they call it. People's Citizenship Guide, a response to Conservative Canada. What's wrong with that?
Why is it a response? Why isn't it a vision of a progressive Canada? This strikes me as sort of petty and surly, and I think that's unfortunate. Plus, I think they should capitalize Canada.
Well, mine is that they are appalled that you are actually required to be a citizen in order to vote. I couldn't believe that they went for this one, but here's what it says. You must apply to become a Canadian citizen, and that's in quotations, to vote in any election in Canada. This means waiting several years after arriving in Canada to become eligible, paying a significant application fee per person, passing a written exam in French or English, and swearing allegiance, perhaps in front of a military official, to the British Queen, who leads a Christian church. Oh, get me the smelling salts. For many people, this process is a barrier to exercising their democratic rights. Come on.
Yeah, but it gives us something to argue with. First of all, this is the Queen of Canada, not of Britain. And secondly, it is a historical fact that our culture of liberty and political rights grows out of the Christian civilization of the Middle Ages. They would say, burn it down, but that's where it comes from.
They actually say that it is all about oppression, that's what comes out of that. And in fact, that's one of your next favorites. They talk about exclusion. Let's show the people that one.
Yeah. Here we go. Canada has a long history of oppression, exclusion, and exploitation. But Canada is also a diverse country made of the labor, ideas, and cultures we all contribute. As though the existing political and economic structures didn't have any cultural support, that there was no sympathy among the people for the way things were done in this country, that they were all either hapless dupes or social activists. And again, this is a vision of the country that a lot of people do share, but it's also a preposterous vision of the country that excludes the fact that for all its flaws, and some of what they point to is very real, Canada was a better place to live than most parts of the world. The reform movements they're so keen on could never have happened outside the West. And this is one of those things they just don't engage with.
They seem to focus on the warts rather than what's good about the country. And that's my problem with it, including this quote about First Nations. It says, for many First Nations, the nation-state of Canada is an imposition and often an unwelcome one. Indigenous peoples have lived in the territories now called Canada. What? For tens of thousands of years. Since the Canadian state has existed, it has been at best ambivalent and at worst explicitly hostile to First Nations, determined to challenge Indigenous peoples and their claims to the land and its resources. Sure, some of that's true, but they only point to it in the worst conditions. People will say, well, you gave the First Nations whiskey. I say they gave us tobacco, and I'd call that a pretty fair trade. They've both wreaked havoc on people.
Yeah, and again, this is where they seem to, this view of history as a plot and this kind of snarkiness. The collision between Europe and the indigenous people of the Americas is one of the great demographic calamities of human history. We'll never know for sure, but it's estimated that the diseases that Europeans brought over contributed to the death of maybe 90 to 95% of the people who lived in the Americas, the largest single die-off in human history. As much as a fifth of mankind may have perished. But nobody could have prevented this. Nobody planned for it. The impact of an urban, technologically advancing civilization that had gunpowder and metallurgy
and wheels
and printing against people who didn't have any of this stuff was bound to result in a cultural and political disaster. But again, they gloss over the fact that many First Nations made brutal war on their neighbors. I mean, not just the Aztecs, the Iroquois were feared and hated. It's all people, and they're unbalanced, and that's one of the things I think is wrong with
colonial society is your next favorite, and this one starts off with saying Canada's still a colonial society?
Yeah, it's a, quote, constitutional monarchy, unquote. What are those quotation marks doing there? With images of the British Queen on its money. She's the Queen of Canada. It's a constitutional fact. It comes out of Magna Carta. The Durham Report was made to the Queen saying give them self-government. It was achieved under a monarchy which is not British exclusively, though it is British. It's Canadian. And this is like you're going to wave this away with some scare quotes. This is not grown up.
And let's go to the last one from me. They want Canada to be Sweden. Not surprised, we are talking about leftists. They love Sweden and IKEA and Volvos. The Canadian economy is an unequal one. Canada has a much higher level of income inequality than Sweden. So Sweden has a less dynamic economy as well. Sweden does not have many of the freedoms that we have. Europeans generally do not have the freedoms and the ability and the social mobility opportunities that we have. They will look and they will say, well, we can move groups of people better, but individuals, no, not necessarily.
Yeah, economic dynamism is a concept foreign to them. And this business, the rich people plotted and the poor made social movements. This economy, this spectacularly successful economy, was built by ordinary working people who were diligent, imaginative, creative, entrepreneurial. They built Canada in an incredibly prosperous way because they had these qualities that they shared with this despised elite of believing this should be a land of opportunity.
Because they were colonialist, imperialist, racist jerks. That's why, John, you should learn a thing or two and read that book. John Robson, thanks so much for playing along. Before we leave, I want to bring up Minister Kenney's office and their response. This is a quote that was sent in to us from Candace Malcolm. She said, they say this imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't the author's intent. From what I saw, it's a catalog of moldy leftist myths. Its stale radicalism isn't even interesting enough to be worth rebutting. Hey, but we just did it. You would have to be a PhD in Marxist sociology or a member of the NDP to believe things like this. Ordinary Canadians have way more common sense.